Great. I've got just a couple of minutes after. This is Russ Carnahan. I'm speaking to you from my home office in St. Louis, Missouri. Also have the co-founder of BuildingAction with us on the call today, Andrew Goldberg, who's in his home in Maryland. Thank you for joining us. This is a continuing of a series of in-person meetings that we started in Washington last fall, continued into early this year. We are very pleased and honored to be joined today by Congressman Don McEachin of Virginia. He is the fourth member of Congress that has spoken to our group. He's been preceded by Chairwoman Castor, by Congressman Tonko, and also Congressman Welch. We also heard from the bipartisan staff of Congressman Welch and McKinley that are chairs of the bipartisan Sustainable Building Caucus, High Performance Building Caucus. And so we want to get this started up today. I want to give just a 1 minute about BuildingAction. Andrew and I founded BuildingAction really early this year officially. It is a 501c organization really focused on building a broader, better connected building sector that can really work to transform America's buildings, support policymakers so that we can make our buildings more sustainable and also contribute to our economic relaunch here in this country. So let's go on to the next slide. A few things we've done. As I said, we've had a lot of engagement with policy makers, connecting leaders and leading organizations around the country with key policy makers as they grapple with how to really engage on the economy and the environment and sustainability, and how buildings can be a key component of that. We have transitioned to do web-based events now. Our goal is to have at least one a month going forward. And next month, we are planning to do a web event on where the two major presidential candidates stand on green buildings. So we'll be getting more information out to you then. We also welcome input about ideas for webinars on issues or key policymakers that you'd like us to try to connect with you. So let's go on to the next slide. The other thing I want you to be aware of, we have done our first ever sign-on letter to Congress about the recovery and how buildings can and should be a part of that. It is really a broad-based letter. We're going to hear more from Andrew Goldberg about that later on in the program. But I think we're up to 26 or so sign-on organizations now. Please take a look at that. If your organization is not on there, please join us. We want to make that point to Congress. We think it's a key time to make that. And with that, I really want to turn to Congressman McEachin. I was recommended to reach out to him by my classmate in Congress, Emanuel Cleaver from Kansas City. And I did not realize until I read your bio, Congressman, that you were involved in so many more areas than I even knew. First, as a key member of the Energy and Commerce Committee and Natural Resources, particularly on the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis. And he also is a co-chair of the Black Caucus, Congressional Black Caucus Energy, Environment, and Agricultural Task Force, and vice chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Coalition. And finally, as if that wasn't enough, he has founded the United for Climate and Environmental Justice Congressional Task Force. So he has a background as a state legislator, as a lawyer and has his divinity degree. So brings a great wealth of legal, government, and spiritual inspiration to us here today. So Congressman Keechan, thank you for being with us virtually. Thank you for your leadership, and we're really anxious to hear from you today. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Russ, and I guess I also need to send out a virtual thank you to Emmanuel Cleaver for recommending me to you. It's quite an honor, and it's exciting to be speaking to your group. I want to thank all the panelists that will be on today, but I have to give a special shout out to DeJuan Robinson, my former constituent. It is good to see you again, my friend, and good to be working with you as we used to do back in at the state level in Virginia. Russ, you know, as a leader on the House Transportation and Infrastructure Committee, you are a powerful voice for greater investment in sustainable infrastructure. And as I said, it is indeed an honor to be working with you today. As our nation continues to navigate these extraordinary times, I know there are competing priorities for your time, and I'm grateful that we are together to discuss how we can infuse equity and justice into our policy and decision making. Tragically, every day, we are witnessing the devastating impacts of coronavirus on communities across our country, including communities within my district. But because of our nation's legacy of systematic racism and environmental inequity, environmental justice communities, low-income communities, communities of color, and tribal and indigenous communities are being disproportionately impacted by the virus. Compounding these long-standing injustices as Americans are under, compounding these long-standing injustices as Americans, each one of us are under orders to shelter in place to combat the spread of COVID-19. Members of the EJ community continue to experience adverse indoor conditions, including exposure to mold, poor ventilation, and lack of access to clean drinking water. To help address these disparities, the House passed H.R. 6800, or as you've heard about it, the HEROES Act, last week. While much of the news has been focused on, and understandably so, funding for our state and local governments, workers, and testing in the HEROES Act, the bill also incorporates funding to help rebuild our economy in ways that are cleaner, healthier, and more just for all communities. For example, the HEROES Act includes legislation I authored allocating $50 million for environmental justice grants to study and address the disproportionate impacts of COVID-19 on EJ communities. Nearly $2 billion to provide portable water to communities affected by the pandemic, including funds available to assist tribal and low-income families with water and wastewater service. A moratorium on dangerous water shutoffs. $1.5 billion for LEAP, that's LIHEP, and $71 million to monitor and fight wildlife-borne diseases to help prevent future pandemics. While I am pleased that the House has taken these bold actions, we all know that more needs to be done. As leaders, it's our responsibility to protect communities from COVID-19, particularly in our hardest hit communities, and to make sure that we build back stronger, more sustainably, and more equitably, all at the same time. Connecting with and learning from EJ communities is critical in this endeavor. For too long, EJ communities have not had a meaningful voice at the table. They've not had a meaningful voice in the decision-making process that ultimately impacts their lives. Guided by Jimenez's priorities of inclusivity and letting people speak for themselves, I began a process last Congress of collaborating with EJ leaders and community members to craft legislation. Working alongside my good friend and Natural Resource Committee Chair, Raul Grijalva, I spent nearly a year and a half listening to and learning from EJ communities about the impacts of our national policies and climate change on their communities. And together we were building a community-led, community-driven process to address the needs and perspectives of the EJ communities. This process led to the introduction of the Environmental Justice for All Act, a comprehensive EJ legislation crafted after countless hours of input and months of open comment. We incorporated hundreds of suggestions from EJ advocates into the final bill. It is with great pride that I say the Environmental Justice for All Act was truly crafted by the people and for the people. This bill is one very important piece of my work to ensure that all the principles of equity and justice are centered in all congressional action. But as we start to look ahead, we must transition to a clean energy economy, and we must update and improve America's infrastructure. We must repair failing roads and bridges and water systems, and we need to modernize our buildings and our electric grid in order that we might address the interrelated crisis of ecological decline and inequity. Greening America's economy will enhance economic opportunity, creating well-paying jobs for those who need them most. And by reducing climate change pollution, it will improve public health. Additionally, it will give us the opportunity to redress long-standing wrongs, to correct decades-old environmental injustices that are still hurting our communities today. The building of this new infrastructure will no doubt help America, help our EJ communities, and most importantly, grant a cleaner future to our children and our children's children. I'm going to wrap up now. There's much to be done, and I look forward to being your partner in that effort. Again, I want to thank you all for allowing me to join this conversation and for sharing your valuable time. And with that, I'm happy to try to answer a few questions.
Great. Thank you so much, Congressman. That's a great example of some really in-depth work that you've done to translate that feedback you've gotten into legislation to actually begin that process, and it's super timely. Let me ask Andrew if we have some questions for you.
So again, thank you, Congressman, for speaking with us. We do have a question about workforce issues, and the question is, even as we have this economic crisis in which there's been unprecedented or historic unemployment, in recent years, we've also seen a challenge in the building industry where a lot of people have been leaving the workforce. What's some have called the silver tsunami as workers retire. And the question is there a way to address both of these concerns, to get people back to work and trained in the kinds of positions to help build a cleaner economy, which would help both address the economic issues, but also make sure that we have a trained workforce to make buildings better?
Absolutely, and you're right. We are facing I won't call it a crisis, but it is certainly a demographic event with a number of folks who are reaching retirement age leaving the workforce, and that's especially hitting the energy area particularly hard, as well as building and trades. We are already crafting in the Congress legislation to try to target certain areas of our country with these jobs and these workforce educational opportunities. One of the subcommittee chairmen of the Energy and Commerce Committee, Chairman Rush, is got a couple of pieces of legislation in that regard. And so your Congress is aware of the challenge, and we want to rise to that challenge and make sure that as we green America, we are also teaching people, giving people the opportunity to learn about these new opportunities, these new businesses, these new technologies, and make sure they have an opportunity to be trained in them. You're absolutely right. That's going to be critical to our success.
We have, let's say, one more question from the attendees. The question is, what future does the Congressman see for the HEROES Act legislation the House passed on Friday. What future does he see for that or process, given that there have been some negative comments from the Senate Majority Leader about taking that up on the Senate side?
Well, for those of you who are somewhat familiar with the operations of Congress, a lot of what the Senate Majority Leader is doing is posturing. He's already conceded in a couple of news articles that they will have to do something. It's a matter of when. And so the way I look at the HEROES Act is that's our marker. That's our opening bid, if you will, as House Democrats speaking to Senate Republicans and to the White House as to what it is we think needs to happen. Obviously, we know that we're not going to get everything we want, and they certainly know that they're going to have to do something. And so we will get together with them, our leadership that is, will get together with their leadership and work out a compromise, and hopefully it'll be soon, but a compromise will occur nonetheless, and we trust the country will be better for it.
Great. I've got one just related question, Congressman, to wrap up. Some folks that we were following recently were talking about basically like an AmeriCorps, modern version of the WPA for rebuilding America's infrastructure, but also including retrofitting America's buildings. As a job creator, but also one that would make us more efficient and more sustainable and healthier. Have you seen much traction on that issue?
We have not seen a lot of traction on that issue simply because COVID-19 is just dominating our legislative plate for right now. But there certainly have been discussions along those lines. And we will need to do something, whether it's using AmeriCorps or using some other entity. We're going to have a group of people who can come in sort of like shock troops and help rebuild America. Because one of the things that we haven't had a lot of time to talk about in this webinar yet is there will be an infrastructure plan, a very serious infrastructure plan. We as House Democrats believe that if we're going to turn this economy back on, you can't do it like a light switch. We've already lost businesses that are not going to come back. And so to replace those jobs and to replace that income that would come into states and localities, as well as the people's pockets, we're going to have an infrastructure plan that's robust, that's 21st century leaning, and that is green. And so you can look forward to that happening later on in the year.
Great. Well, thank you again so much for your time today and sharing your expertise and the leadership you're continuing in Congress. We look forward to engaging further with you and your staff, and certainly BuildingAction and folks in our coalition want to be a resource for you.
Well, you know where I am. Call on us anytime.
Fantastic. Thanks so much, Congressman.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye now. Let's see, Andrew, thank you. On this next slide, you see our next three speakers. Dewan Robinson from Natural Resources Defense Council, Nadia Dutchin from PowerShift Network, Cara Salranali from the Building Performance Association, and we're going to go in that order. Starting with Dewan, he focuses on promoting increased access to energy efficiency and renewable energy resources for multifamily and low-income households. As part of the Energy Efficiency for All project, Dwayne helps organize state coalitions and provides educational support for organizations and individuals working on energy efficiency and renewable energy programs. Dwayne, I'm going to turn it over to you. Welcome. Thank you for being here, and thanks for the work you're doing. We're anxious to hear more about it.
Yeah, thank you very much, Russ. Appreciate it. So good afternoon, everyone who tuned in to the webinar. Thanks for joining. My name is Dewan Robinson. I work for the Natural Resources Defense Council, and I'm based in Washington, D.C. And so before I begin my presentation, you heard Congressman McEachin at the beginning give me a quick shout out that that he appreciated the work that we spent together. So yes, I was his constituent. I used to live in Richmond, Virginia, before I moved to DC, working on a state-based nonprofit focused on energy and climate, where the congressman was my state senator and representative, and where we worked together quite substantially on climate and energy issues. So I want to thank him, and I've seen firsthand his dedication on matters related to clean energy and climate change. So yeah, it's good to see the work that he's continuing to do in Washington. So at NRDC, I work on a project called Energy Efficiency for All, or EFA for short. Next slide, please. Energy Efficiency for All, or EFA, is a multi-organizational partnership that includes national partners of my organization, NRDC, the National Housing Trust, Elevate Energy, and the Energy Foundation. So these four organizations partner and collaborate with community-based organizations in 12 states across the country. The 12 states that you see highlighted on your screen, focused on improving the lives of families in underrepresented communities at the intersection of energy, health, and housing affordability, specifically for residents living in multifamily buildings. So on the project, I direct our campaigns in our Northeast and our Mid-Atlantic states. But the activities in all of our states are generally the same. Our partners engage with decision makers in all forums, public utility commissions, state legislatures, housing and energy administrative agencies, direct engagement with energy companies themselves, all in order to strengthen the policies and programs to provide a healthier, more energy efficient home for everyone. We also have a federal advocacy team, of which I'm a part, working to educate and influence Congress on the importance of some of the initiatives that you heard the congressman talk about, weatherization assistance, energy bill, and rental assistance, for example. So I appreciate BuildingAction's and this webinar's focus on equity specifically, again, that you heard referenced earlier, on ensuring that we provide benefits and solutions in these areas truly to all people, regardless of one's race and economic status, and perhaps focusing specifically on providing benefits and solutions to those who are minorities and who have less financial means, because that's where the inequities are the most pronounced. So, I appreciate the focus on equity, because equity is very much at the core of our project, Energy Efficiency for All, in all of our states, and it's something that I care deeply about. And what I mean by equity is not simply providing the same services to everyone. That's equality, not equity. Equity is doing whatever is necessary to ensure that vulnerable communities have equal outcomes, because the barriers for those communities and the burdens placed on those communities have historically not been equally distributed. So that's true in the climate change fight, where a recent study noted that whites experience 17% less pollution exposure than they cause, whereas blacks experience 56% more and Hispanics 63% more pollution than they cause. So we see the disparities in climate, but we also see the disparities in energy within our homes, which is the focus on our project. Next slide, please. So a few years ago, EFA partnered with ACEEE to produce this report that you see on the left, which looked at the energy burdens of residents in 50 of the largest cities in America. And the report had results broken down by race and whether residents were homeowners or renters. So for clarification, as you see on the right, energy burden, the definition of what we mean by that, energy burden means the percentage of household income that is spent on energy bills. Ideally, you'd want an energy burden of less than 3%, and an energy burden greater than 6% is considered by experts to be high. The median energy burden across all the cities that we looked at for the purposes of this report was at 3.5%, so a little higher than ideal. But what we found is that Black households had a 54% higher energy burden than the median, and Latino households had a 17% higher higher energy burden than the median. Next slide, please. So what we also found is that minority households paid more in energy costs per square foot of their homes than white households, and that renters paid more per square foot of their homes than homeowners. Now, how can that be? So the full answer will take a lot longer than we have time for today, but the simple answer is that these homes, Blacks, Latinos, renters, the houses themselves, the structures, the buildings are older, they are more drafty, they are more likely to be run down, they are unhealthy, and they are less efficient. So the housing stock itself is inequitable. So even beyond providing solutions equally, on energy, we have much more work to do within society at large to ensure that we have equitable housing policies to have families have a more stable living environment. Next slide, please, which is the last slide. So obviously, we're living in a time of great uncertainty. And as the congressman said, it's kind of all COVID response all the time. You know, we understand the challenging times that we're living in, and that's certainly right within our scope of work. What we have found is that in many ways, the COVID crisis is both exacerbating the housing and energy inequities that we have in society, but they're also exposing them. And so COVID is highlighting for us these, or some of these inequities. So to try to help guide decision makers through the early stages of this crisis, IFA recently released this pandemic response guide that you see on the right and that you can download on our website. But in short, I will briefly hit on a few points that everyone should consider on this topic in light of the current pandemic. First, we have to ensure that everyone has access to energy and water, which obviously are vital necessities. That includes some of the moratoriums on shutoffs that many utilities have, and making sure residents can afford their services when the moratoriums eventually expire. It also means doing what we should have done a long time ago, and that's doubling down not only on energy, but water quality issues, particularly in some of our more urban areas. Second, we have to prevent vulnerable people from getting evicted and preserve affordable housing generally. A recent report noted that 40% of people making $40,000 or less annually have already lost their jobs in this current pandemic. When you sit back and you think about it, that is an absolute staggering figure, and very soon we will have a significant housing problem with families not being able to afford their rents. So Congress needs to address this. We must continue to beef up emergency rental assistance in the short term, and then also think about the longer term investments in affordable housing. And lastly, we need to protect our workers in the energy services industry. With the stay-at-home orders in effect, many utilities have issued stop work orders to prevent energy efficiency workers from going into homes and providing the services that we know that families continue to need. And many of these workers are small businesses. They have taken an immediate hit like many other folks. And so we need to think about the long-term workforce development and the future workforce development, as you heard Congressman McEachin talk about, in the greening of the American economy. But that's what we have to do now and in the future to ensure that we are on the right foot. But there's many other things that we need to do. That is just a quick synopsis in the time that I had this afternoon. So I will pause there and then pass it back to Russ and the other two panelists that we have lined up. Thank you.
Great, Dewan. Thank you very much for that overview. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our next panelist, Nadia Dutchin. She is the co-executive director of the Power Shift Network, which mobilizes the collective power of young people to mitigate climate change and create a just, clean, and energy efficient future with thriving communities for all. Nadia, welcome, and thanks for joining us on this virtual meeting.
Thank you so much for having me. I feel as if Dewan probably um, has been reading my mind because that's quite a bit of, of what I wanted to speak about. The PowerShift Network, we are a network, a decentralized network of about 95 plus organizations. They range from small high school groups to the big greens like Sierra Club and 350.org. Highlighting the point that COVID has really brought to bear the inadequacies and inequities here in the United States within our government, federal, state, and local. The thing that we've been rallying around as of late has been providing mutual aid, COVID mutual aid. That has looked like quite a few things as our network members support a lot of different types of work. And the issues have been exacerbated because people are forced to work remotely and try to organize remotely because there are communities that are in acute distress. For example, one of our network members, the Newark Water Coalition, they have the same issue that Flint has, and they serve a huge population of people outside of the city of Newark from their water system, and they provide generally bottled water and water filters to families. But in the time here of COVID, it's been very, very difficult for them to organize and provide those services and that clean water to communities that are in need. Our concern in general is ensuring that young people receive the training that they need in order to facilitate the next wave of climate and environmental justice. Congressman McEachern alluded to, training to ensure that we have, green construction, retrofitting, and in that, one of the concerns that we have with the large convergence that we plan called PowerShift, the next one is scheduled to be held next April in New Orleans, Louisiana. We're hoping that we will be able to obtain funding so that we can provide training to young people to ensure that homes have LEED certification, that there are LEED certification building standards that for new construction and to retrofitted homes. I live in Baltimore, and it is a real problem here. Our infrastructure, our housing infrastructure, and our transportation infrastructure, and it's killing our community. We are not even able to plant food in our soil. And in some places, the water quality is horrible, and in our schools, it most certainly is. So while our focus is on developing leadership in young people, it's a little bit difficult to do so with the infrastructure gaps that we have in cities like Newark and in Baltimore and in Detroit and Flint and other places like that. And it's not just because they're not in the news, it does not mean that they're not happening. Alluding to what Dewan mentioned about the energy burden, again, most of our young people work hourly jobs while they organize, and they're not able to sustain themselves. They're bearing a huge energy burden in inadequate housing. They have higher rates of asthma and other issues, lead poisoning, for example, that bring us great concern. And so in that, we are working to create a space at PowerShift Convergence so that we can discuss these things and we can talk about what legislation and advocacy looks like moving forward to ensure that there's enough funding for grassroots organizations that are organizing around those issues, as well as providing funding for young people, particularly Black and Indigenous organizers, to receive training and certifications so that we can implement and enforce LEED and WELL certification standards within our cities. I worked for an organization that builds community solar. That's a great opportunity to train people who don't have a college education to help build solar directly in our communities, thereby lowering the energy burden for people in urban areas. The same could be said for rural areas where income can be very low and energy burden can be very high. So I think equity and justice are things that we need to be thinking about on the forefront. And I think what concerns all of us is that we are seeing a trend toward continuing to prop up a failing capitalist society without thinking about the fallout on people who don't have a voice. I think I probably will end it there. If folks have questions, I'm happy to answer them. But Again, we're deeply concerned about the lack of infrastructure and organizing and the ability for young people to organize around these issues in their communities. And so, ensuring that we have enough funding and training and educational opportunities to provide young people so that they can take us into the future, that would be greatly ideal and appreciated. Thank you so much for this. I really appreciate it.
And Nadia, thank you very much for being with us today and for the work that you all are doing, especially reaching out to young people. That is such an important element of this in terms of training and advocacy.
Thank you.
So our last speaker, certainly not the least, Carl Saul Rinaldi. Carl is Vice President of Government Relations at the Building Performance Association. She has over 20 years experience in the energy, climate, and policy advocacy. She's worked for members of Congress, testified before congressional committees, and appeared in a variety of media outlets as a leading energy and climate policy expert. We're very pleased to have her join us from her varied expertise, but also to catch us up on the work that she is doing with the Building Performance Association. Cara, it's all yours.
Thank you, and I appreciate being invited to participate in this esteemed panel. The Building Performance Association is an association, a national association that works on the built environment and to advance energy efficiency. And a lot of our focus has been on the residential space. So equity is, of course, a huge concern. How programs can be accessed by low-income families as well as disadvantaged communities. And Mr. Robinson and Ms. Dutchin already talked about the fact that climate impacts are often most felt by disadvantaged communities, and making certain that those communities can also access programs to help address those issues is really important. And these are all issues that BPA has been working on. Next slide, please. As we already heard today, I won't get into, Representative McEachin already told us so much about what's been happening on the response, the stimulus response to COVID-19. But I did want to highlight that a couple of the things he mentioned, both the home energy and water continuity provisions, the LIHEAP provisions, these were all provisions that are in the HEROES Act that would be helpful in addressing some of the equity issues. Last week, E for the Future released a report that said that 594,000 clean energy jobs have been lost since the beginning of the pandemic. And so it's also those who are in the community who are trying to address these issues in the built environment that are also being impacted and joining the unemployed and the low income communities. So one of the things that BPA has been doing is trying to work to see what's the next phase, that infrastructure phase that we heard Representative McEachin talk about. Next slide, please. The Building Performance Association has been, along with a number of coalition partners, has been pressing for a Hope for Home stimulus proposal as part of the next infrastructure element, a way in which to both advance workforce training and to advance homeowner energy efficiency rebates to ensure that we keep getting that energy efficiency and clean energy into buildings across the spectrum of incomes. Next slide, please. The first slide on HOPE, the Home Online Performance-Based Energy Efficiency, is just to note that this is a $500 million workforce training proposal, which would include online training. So this would allow, no matter whether or not you're still under a stay-at-home order or whether or not you are in a transition with your job, you would have an opportunity to do online training to participate in rebate programs and upgrades. That includes health and safety training. That includes, issues related to mold remediation. That includes weatherization training to be part of the weatherization workforce. So it's a greatly expanded opportunity to support training in building science, so that contractors, whether HVAC contractors wanting to learn more about insulation or insulation contractors wanting to learn more about mold remediation, or managers who want to learn more about the accounting so that they're help with their business itself. It's an opportunity that with that workforce training to pretty much to raise the quality of the contracting, the education in the contracting community. Next slide. And then in addition to that, we've seen that the Homeowner Managing Energy Savings Act, which has been around for a while, but has had some key changes that specifically address some of these equity issues we're talking about today. So this is a rebate program to do upgrades for energy efficiency. And to note that around the country, we're seeing some rebate programs fading or being stalled because the utility programs that often fund some of these rebates are struggling because of changes to how the electric loads are right now across the country. So we want to make certain that we continue to have rebate programs and incentives for people to invest in energy efficiency in their buildings. We have to remember that when we look at the curves of the grid and the demand, power plants are built to the maximum demand and peak, and lots of peaks occur during residential hours. We have new peaks during the pandemic as people are at home in we will continue to see changes in how the grid responds to both when people are at home, people go back to work, and we want to make certain that we take that stress down off the grid. And that's part of addressing our climate change challenges, is incorporating residential buildings, incorporating all buildings as a part of our response to climate change and addressing, grid vulnerabilities. The Homeowner Managing Savings Act will help bring more workers back to provide energy efficiency to those homes. One of the things that Mr. Robinson mentioned, the inequity in the energy burden, tenants versus homeowners. This is an issue that the Homes Act would help with. In the earlier version, owners that had tenants that weren't occupied, so they weren't owner-occupied buildings, couldn't take advantage. We've changed that because to ensure that there's still an incentive to upgrade a building, even if there's a renter who is going to be paying those utility bills. Also, there's in the new version of the bill, there will be additional rebates for those in the low-income communities to, again, hopefully provide a more inclusive rebates. So we have more people who are able to take advantage of these rebate programs. And again, even though tax credits are really important and those are the only federal incentives we have, there are many people who don't have a tax burden right now because they don't have taxable income. So ensuring that we can bring those rebates forward to address those inefficient homes is really key. Next slide. There's other federal legislation that addresses a number of these issues, so I did want to highlight them. The Weatherization Enhancement Act, which is the Weatherization Reauthorization Bill. Weatherization is a crucial federal program that helps low-income families weatherize their homes to address their energy burdens, and that's a key program. And we have seen and hope under ERA there was the stimulus bills gave significantly more funding to the weatherization program, and we'd like to see that again. But there's also a reauthorization bill that's been moving through Congress, as well as Chairman Rush's legislation on the Blue Collar to Green Collar Jobs Act, which again provides additional training and specifically addresses a lot of that training to in workforce grants to disadvantaged communities. Next slide, please. And I know we'd like to get to questions, but I did want to mention there's a number of key reports that are out there, some that have already been talked about today, that address healthcare, that address the fact that there's a health issue related to buildings and into the built environment that we need to address. It's particularly a problem in disadvantaged communities. when owners aren't the ones paying the utility bill and renters are the ones paying the utility bill, you often find those that inequity on the energy burden because the tenants are paying a bill and have no recourse for the upgrades. These are the types of things that some of these reports address. Next slide. I'm just going to note a few things that that the Building Performance Association has been working on during the COVID-19 pandemic. But please go to the website, buildingperformance.org. You'll find because our membership, we have a membership of about 10,000, many of whom are weatherization and home performance contractors. We continue to update that with things that are going on at the state level and at the federal level. So I won't spend a ton of time here on this, but traditional pro-efficiency arguments still apply during the pandemic about why energy efficiency is important to upgrading, both for climate change and for low-income families. Next slide. In New York, there's been a number of these combinations. A lot of the things that Mr. Robinson and Ms. Dutchin have already addressed are being addressed at some of the state levels. Some states are obviously listening to this message and are trying to incorporate them in some of their responses. Not across the board, but we are seeing some of that. In New York, for example, there was an energy affordability issue that we submitted comments on, trying to address subsidizing online training so that so those contractors who have lost their jobs or people who are in transition can do some of that online training. In New Jersey, they just actually, there are comments that are being offered right now on equity in energy efficiency, trying to make certain that these programs aren't just being taken advantage of by those who can afford to do the upgrades, but to really help actually provide an incentive so that we are moving the bar on buildings and making them more sustainable around the country. Next slide. In Connecticut, we've seen this as well with online training, and as well as in California, that contractors who've been laid off have been allowed to have advanced payments to continue doing work if they can do work for those in the low-income utility programs. So many HVAC contractors have been under the pandemic seen as essential workers, particularly to address HVAC emergency needs, and this has also been something that we're seeing in some of the states where they're trying to ensure that the low-income families will get those rebates first. I know we've also seen that in Arizona, where they were looking to try and make certain to increase rebates for those who have been affected by the pandemic and lost their jobs. But it continues to be a challenge, because if you're in Arizona and it's 100 degrees and you have lost your air conditioning and your whole family is sheltering in place, but you've also lost your job, a $5,000 air conditioner is a high burden. So how do you address those? And I know that utilities across the country are trying to figure that out and how to use their DSM programs and work with their public utility commissions to make that happen. And it's a challenge that is frankly being addressed all across the country right now. Next slide. Oh, and that was my last slide. Thank you. I really appreciate being a part of this great panel, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Great, thank you so much. Thanks to all of our panelists. We left a few minutes for questions here as we conclude. Let me ask Andrew if we have some questions for our panelists.
Yeah, so a couple of questions from the chat room. The first question, it's very specific, and I'm going to actually edit it and make it a little broader because it's an interesting point. The question specifically is, as a tenant or a landlord, what rights are enforceable with regard to air quality of interior living spaces when neighboring tenants' smoke migrates into other interior spaces? That's a specific question, but it does raise a larger question about what landlords and building owners are able to do or can do to make sure that their buildings are healthy and also sustainable. And to what extent do all of you kind of see what the role of building owners in this, particularly when we're talking about rental facilities, and how can we make sure that those who live in who rent facilities are able to enjoy the benefits of more sustainable and healthier environments. And I'll start with any order you want, but maybe we'll take it in reverse order from the panel. So Kara.
Sure. So my first answer is that in most states have a license for landlords, and that licensed buildings have to adhere to certain standards, certain building standards and building codes. Now, this is a state by state issue, so you'd have to look to your state for that, for what exactly is the requirement of the building owner, and what they can require of their tenants. But health and safety standards tend to be, clearly in those. Usually they address things like smoke detectors more so than a lot of the air quality issues. But if you have a specific concern related to asthma, we have seen in certain places that there has been litigation that has been able to be, if you can make those connections. Certainly natural gas and those types of safety issues are in the codes, but it is a state by state issue. Mold and energy efficiency and things like that. That's one of the reasons why we need codes and standards when buildings are built in the first place, so that we can make certain that, and then we have appliance standards, so we can make certain that the last thing that can be put in to a new air HVAC is at the highest standard and the highest efficiency. That would be my answer.
Great, Nadja.
And I second that. I think having high efficiency HVAC systems is the way to go. And if there are ways to enforce the barrier between living spaces or interior spaces, increasing the efficiency of any insulation that may be between places. Between homes, or again, maybe it's a common room. That may be the secondary thing I would recommend.
Yeah, Andrew, addressing the expanded version of that question, as you put it, there's two things that come to mind, and the first was mentioned by Kara in her presentation. She referenced what is known within our circles as the split incentive problem, quote unquote. Whereas you have an owner of a building, and the tenants are paying for the utilities. What incentive is there, for the renter to pay for energy efficiency upgrades? They're just renting. They're renting the property. They're paying their own utilities, and so, but they're just renting it, and so they're not incentivized for any longer term investments. But the owner or the landlord of the building, if the tenant are paying the utilities, they're not covering the energy costs, and so you have this dichotomy of interest here in funding long-term energy efficiency improvements, and that's just been a difficult financial nugget to crack, so to speak. Stepping back even further beyond that, though, before we even get to the energy efficiency upgrades themselves, there are other health and safety issues that we have to look at in terms of the home. There are many lower income buildings, lower income residents that have mold or other structural problems that would prevent traditional energy efficiency upgrades from even taking place, because you have those structural deficiencies in the home. So we have to think not only about the energy efficiency measure itself, but also what are we doing for the longer term, more structural issues in relation to the home to ensure those health and safety measures are appropriately upgraded.
Great, thank you, Duan. Andrew, any other questions on your end?
Yeah, so one more question, which is, so the question is, how can companies and groups that are in the building sector, those who make buildings, meaning architects, engineers, contractors, HVAC specialists, what is the best way? How can they get involved and get engaged with a lot of the programs that you've talked about, just like Nadja, your programs at the community level, to make sure that benefits of efficiency and sustainable buildings are shared by everybody? What are some of the best ways that they can become more involved in making sure their services, their expertise, it really can be accessed and enjoyed by everyone? Maybe we'll start with Nadja first.
See, Nadia, if you could unmute your
Yes.
microphone. There you
Yes,
go.
sorry about that. I had a small interruption walk by. Can you please repeat the question?
Now, Andrew, there
Sure,
you go.
there we go. How can folks, the fun of webinars, how can folks who are involved in the building sector, architects and engineers, HVAC installers, contractors, become really more engaged in helping make sure that their expertise and the ability to create more efficient, healthy spaces are really shared by everybody?
I think clearly education is helpful. I don't think people realize what the remedy is for sick buildings or, sick infrastructure, if you will. I think allying themselves with community organizations and educating people about why those things are necessary and important is helpful. I think the other thing is investment in the community. As I mentioned, WELL and LEED certifications can be attained by anyone as long as you've graduated from high school. Investing in scholarships so that community members can police their own buildings. There's generally a very innate lack of trust for people who are outsiders, if you will. Letting the community police themselves and be vigilant about their own infrastructure is very helpful. So I think if they are looking to create value, if you will, for the work that they do, they need to create value for it for the community themselves. And that's not something that anyone else can do. They have to do that.
Great. Duan?
Yeah, I would concur with that shortly.
One with you, Kara.
Well, I agree with everything Nadia said. I would add that we have if there are contractors and businesses that want to participate in some of these additional programs, there are many manufacturers have programs that support low-income communities, as do utilities, and that they should reach out and find them, because the programs are there and in a lot of places and should be utilized more broadly. And I think if there's a greater demand, there'll be more. So that's we'd like to see more demand from the business community for these types of programs.
Great. Well, I want to take this opportunity to thank each of you for being a part of this. I think it was, we packed a lot into this hour. So thanks for being efficient with your proposals. We will have this, I understand, Andrew, on our buildingaction.org website where people can access it later. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah, that's correct.
And then we'll be getting information out about our June event. Right now we're scheduled to talk about Campaign 2020 and with sharing the building agendas from both of the major presidential campaigns. And again, we'll be seeking ideas on subject matters and policy experts that we can engage in these programs. And then finally, again, thanks to the many folks that have signed on as allies of Building Action formally and that have become founding members or donors. That has really helped us launch this new national coalition, and we think it's going to be a real benefit to policy makers and a benefit to the members. Information sharing that they can do. And I also want to recognize our key founding members, National Electrical Contractors Association, the Steel Framing Industry Association, and the International Facilities Management Association. And with that, I want to hand it over to Andrew to give us one last update on our congressional sign-on letter that we want to finalize and get that to the Hill this week. Andrew?
Great, thanks, Russ. Yeah, and if you haven't seen the letter already, it's a letter we've drafted to Congress and the White House. And really the broad message is make sure that buildings are part of the recovery. If you look at the challenges we face right now with the economic crisis we're in, if you look at the issue related to health, of course, as well as the ever-present issues about climate issues we talked about today. Buildings can and should be part of it, getting people back to work, designing, building, operating, maintaining buildings that are healthier, that are more sustainable are critical. And as Congress, as we heard, moves up towards an infrastructure package, hopefully coming into the fall, we want to make sure that buildings are part of that. The letter we have, we closed it last Friday. However, we're not sending it out for a few more days. If you are able to join onto that letter, we encourage your organization or company, we encourage you to do so. You can find it again at the website listed there, buildingaction.org/recovery, or you can reach out to either Russ or me, and we encourage you to take a look at that and sign on.
Great. Thank you, Andrew. Thanks, everybody, for being with us today. And we look forward to continuing to grow this coalition, to have the broadest and best connected building coalition out there. And we look forward to engaging with you all in the weeks and months ahead. Thank you all so much. Have a great rest of the week. Bye now.
So much.